A flight attendant tied a black CEO to a seat with zip cords, but he calmly freed himself, exposed the crew's misconduct, and brought the entire flight to a halt. He tied the black CEO to a seat with zip cords, thinking restraint could intimidate him. He didn't realize the man he restrained could snap the cords and snap the attacker's arm in the process. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always meets instant and unstoppable consequences. The seatbelt sign had just dimmed when Merrick Halden made his first move. He leaned in toward seat 2A, clipboard tight against his chest like a shield. "Sir, I'll need you to switch with the gentleman in 4C, he said flatly, gesturing with his chin toward a bulky man surrounded by two men in black suits. The cabin was still settling, luggage thudding into overhead bins, seatbelts clicking, the hum of the engine steady and low. But something about Merrick's tone cut through it all. It wasn't a request. It was a warning. Dr. Ariane Velis slowly looked up. At 41, the CEO of Vernitech Systems exuded the kind of self-control that unnerved people who didn't understand it. He held the eyes of the attendant for a brief, weighted second. "This is my assigned seat," he said calmly, his voice barely above the cabin noise. "And I'm not moving." Merrick's jaw clenched, a twitch running down his cheek like a cracked wire. "The other passenger prefers to sit up front," he said, attempting a diplomatic veneer. "He's traveling with security." "So am I," Ariane replied, and tapped twice on the biometric briefcase that rested snugly between his legs. "That's why I'm here. My seat, my security clearance, my silence." Merrick took a breath, then smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll need to store that briefcase in the overhead compartment, sir." "There is no such requirement," Ariane said, not shifting an inch. "According to FAA Code 62C, Section 7, Clause 4, secure biometric equipment may remain within arm's reach if positioned safely and without obstruction. Would you like me to cite the exact memo?" His tone was still calm, but colder now, like steel pressed beneath velvet. Around them, passengers began to glance over, sensing a disturbance. One of the bodyguards from 4C turned his head, frowning. Merrick's posture stiffened. "You're not special," Merrick muttered, just loud enough for the row behind to hear. Ariane turned his gaze fully on him now. "Neither are flight regulations when they're based on ego." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was electric. Merrick's nostrils flared. He stepped back a half-inch, eyes flicking toward the galley, then to the front of the cabin. A decision hardened in his expression, as if some unseen line had been crossed. "Fine," Merrick snapped, retreating a few steps before lifting the intercom handset just beside the service counter. His voice, falsely professional now, echoed into the cabin. "Crew, I need immediate assistance in row 2. Passenger is refusing lawful crew instruction and may be escalating." Passengers froze. Phones weren't raised yet, but they hovered near tray tables. Two male crew members appeared quickly from the galley, both with subdued expressions and glances that avoided Ariane entirely. They stood behind Merrick like sentries awaiting command. Ariane's jaw tightened. He had studied postures like this in diplomatic simulations, had modeled emotional escalation in AI response systems for conflict zones. Merrick's energy wasn't about procedure. It was about dominance disguised as regulation. He scanned the faces around him, 10 rows forward, 12 back. Men, women, a teenage boy by the window, a father with a toddler over his shoulder. None of them looked afraid of Ariane, only confused, cautious. "Is there a supervisor I can speak to?" Ariane asked plainly. "You'll speak to protocol," Merrick snapped back. "Let's show him who runs this cabin." The two male crew members exchanged a glance before moving toward Ariane. Merrick's eyes narrowed, satisfied. The flight had just leveled out at 28,000 feet, but something far more dangerous had just taken off inside row 2A. And Merrick Halden had no idea he'd just challenged the man who wrote the very compliance laws he was now abusing. The moment Merrick Halden reached into the rear galley and pulled out the bright orange zip cords, a hush fell over the cabin like a sudden drop in air pressure. No one had expected it, not the passengers flipping through safety brochures, not the businessman nodding off 2 rows behind, and certainly not Dr. Arion Velis, who remained seated in 2A with his hands resting calmly on his lap. The cords glinted under the overhead lights, stark against Merrick's Navy uniform. "Passenger in 2A is becoming agitated," Merrick announced loudly, his voice artificially elevated for the audience. "We're initiating restraint protocol for crew safety." A murmur of confusion rippled through the nearby passengers. Arion hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even shifted in his seat. But now, 2 additional male crew members, tall, unsmiling, stood beside Merrick, their expressions unreadable as they approached. Arion didn't flinch. He tilted his chin slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to register the angles, their approach paths, and where each exit was located. One of the crew members reached forward and snapped the first cord around Arion's right wrist, tightening it until the nylon cut into skin. Arion raised his other hand voluntarily, his voice composed. "You're making an operational error," he said quietly, meeting Merrick's eyes. "I am not resisting, nor have I violated any federal flight protocol." Merrick ignored him. "We've got a non-compliant passenger who refuses to follow storage procedures and has challenged crew authority." "I haven't left my seat," Arion replied, his voice steady, but lower now, meant only for those within earshot. "And that briefcase is a secured biometric container authorized for in-cabin retention under Clause 7B. You're not just misinformed. You're escalating a falsehood." But it didn't matter. The second zip cord was already secured. Arion's hands were now lashed together at the wrists, looped beneath the armrest like he was being shackled for transport. The cabin reacted with stunned disbelief. In row 5, a teenager with a mop of curly hair raised his phone and hit the record button. "He's not even doing anything," he whispered to his seatmate. "Why are they tying him up?" Several other passengers followed suit, holding up their phones, some hesitating, some clearly live-streaming. One man in a pilot's jacket muttered, "This isn't how restraint protocol works," but Merrick was unfazed. He stepped back with a self-satisfied smirk and straightened his jacket. "You'll remain restrained," he said, projecting again, "until the captain reviews the situation and authorizes your release." Arion stared at him, saying nothing. Inside, his mind was already working at full capacity. His breathing slowed deliberately, syncing with his heart rate. He noted the brand of the cords: standard security issue, nylon composite, non-metallic, not reinforced, no secondary lock mechanism, not military grade. His muscles tensed against the restriction, not enough to resist, just enough to test the give. He scanned the passengers again, logging expressions: fear, confusion, silent support. The boy in row 3B met his gaze. Arion gave a subtle nod. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He was reading potential allies. Merrick wasn't done. With one final theatrical motion, he stepped to the aisle, lifted Arion's biometric briefcase with the side of his shoe, and kicked it gently down the aisle. The case tumbled end over end before coming to a halt near the lavatory door. The impact wasn't hard, but the message was clear. A few audible gasps echoed in the cabin. The briefcase was visibly marked with a federal compliance seal. One man leaned over to his wife and whispered, "Isn't that illegal?" Merrick turned, noticing the briefcase's position, and made a show of brushing off his hands. "Now maybe you'll learn to follow instructions like everyone else." Arion didn't respond immediately. His gaze stayed fixed on the briefcase for a full 5 seconds. Then he slowly turned his head back toward Merrick, eyes unreadable. "Do you even know what jurisdiction you've just crossed?" he asked softly, his voice a low current of ice and fire. Merrick blinked, suddenly less sure of his footing. "Excuse me?" Arion didn't blink. "You just crossed a jurisdiction you don't even understand." 10 minutes had passed since Arion Velis was zip-tied to his seat, and still no senior crew member had arrived. 20 minutes now. The silence was louder than any alarm. A low current of tension rippled through the cabin of Aerovex Flight 944. Uneasy whispers from row to row, phones quietly lifted under tray tables, and the subtle glances of passengers trying to interpret what exactly they were witnessing. Abuse? A protocol gone rogue? Or something else entirely? Merrick Halden, standing just a few feet ahead in the aisle, appeared unfazed. He leaned against the galley counter with an arrogant smirk, one hand holding a paper cup of steaming coffee, the other perched lazily on his hip. He chuckled at something one of the other crew members said under their breath, clearly pleased with himself. To him, this was victory, a silent takedown of a passenger he considered too calm, too confident, too composed. The irony was thick. Merrick had no idea he'd already triggered a federal chain reaction the moment Ariane's restraint was logged by the AI in Ariane's encrypted watch, which began recording the incident automatically. But Ariane said nothing. He just sat still, studying. His body didn't betray the calculations unfolding in his mind. Every blink, every shallow breath, every scan of his periphery was data. The cords digging into his wrists were thick, designed for quick restraint, not for long-term durability. They were industrial grade, not military, and whoever tied them hadn't looped through a secondary lock. A mistake. Ariane's right elbow shifted imperceptibly, pressing outward against the seat armrest, his fingers curling inward ever so slightly. He didn't force. He flexed, measured resistance, pressure. Give, there. A hairline split. The first fray in the zip cord came without a sound, no more dramatic than the quiet creak of a seat recline. He paused, not from doubt but from strategy. He didn't want movement to be noticed yet, not until the second restraint was ready. His gaze drifted across the cabin and paused. Row 3, Seat B. A 12-year-old boy with a mop of curly hair and wide, fearful eyes. The boy had noticed. His mouth parted. He gasped softly. Ariane met his gaze, held it with calm gravity, and gave the faintest nod. Not to shush him, to reassure him. He turned inward again, his left wrist, a tighter loop but less reinforced. He rotated his forearm slowly against the plastic cord, wrist muscle engaging, skin heating with friction. And then, snap. The crack was barely audible over the hum of the aircraft, but undeniable. The plastic ruptured and slinked away in two curling strands. Ariane's arms were free, and then he stood. The motion wasn't abrupt. There was no rush, no fury, just steady, deliberate ascent. Passengers nearby leaned back instinctively. A few murmured. Someone's phone clattered to the floor. Merrick's spine straightened in confusion. Then his lips curled in disbelief. His brow furrowed as he spun around. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked. No response. "Sit down right now." But Ariane didn't stop. He took a measured step forward, the remnants of the zip cords falling from his wrists like discarded threads. The sound they made as they hit the cabin floor was quiet, but final, like the turning of a page in a courtroom transcript. "You misread silence as weakness," Ariane said, his voice low, clear, and unervingly calm. He didn't raise his arms. He didn't posture. His presence alone did the work. Passengers sat frozen, watching the moment unfold like a courtroom drama they hadn't paid to attend. "Now you'll understand what enforcement really means." Merrick lunged without a word, his face taut, movements sharp, believing that speed alone could overpower authority. The cords still lay near Ariane's feet, but Merrick didn't reach for them. He went directly for Ariane's shoulders, arms outstretched, aiming to shove him back into the seat, perhaps thinking that a show of dominance might restore whatever control he thought he had left. But he had forgotten who he was dealing with. Ariane didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped laterally, fluidly, allowing Merrick's momentum to pass beside him. In one smooth motion, Ariane caught the man's wrist, twisted gently, but with undeniable force, until a sickening crack echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Merrick dropped with a scream, crumpling onto the aisle carpet. His left arm dangled grotesquely, bent where no joint existed. The crowd gasped. A boy near the front winced and looked away, but someone in the back clapped once, loudly. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Ariane stood over the injured attendant, calm but not passive. His breaths were measured. He bent down briefly, not to apologize, not to scold, but to retrieve the intercom device from the wall. It clicked as he lifted it, his voice smooth and clipped with authority. "This is Dr. Ariane Velis," he said, eyes still scanning the frozen rows of stunned passengers. "I am declaring this flight compromised under the Intercarrier Protection Clause 7C. It was not a plea. It was a declaration, a line drawn through fear, incompetence, and the abuse of authority." For a moment, the only response was the soft hum of the aircraft and Merrick's shallow, pained breathing. Then the speakers crackled again, not from the cockpit, but from row 9. "Stand down," a deep voice said, clear and resolute. "I've got eyes. He's right." All heads turned toward the man who stood now in the aisle. Tall, solid build, black blazer slightly unbuttoned, a flash of silver badge beneath his collar. The air marshal had been on board all along, embedded quietly, stationed in disguise. Ariane didn't nod. He didn't need to. Recognition passed between them silently, the kind reserved for men who understood protocol and lived by structure. Seconds later, the cockpit door opened with a slow mechanical groan. The captain emerged, his steps hesitant, face drained of color. In his trembling hand was a tablet, its screen glowing faintly. He approached Ariane, still processing the line of code blinking at him. "Federal alert, biometric clearance breach, Velis, Ariane D." The warning had arrived moments after Merrick had zip-tied him. "Sir," the captain began, voice low, almost apologetic. "We didn't know." "That's the problem," Ariane cut in, his voice sharper now, each word landing like a gavel. "You didn't ask. You didn't check. You complied." He turned, addressing the passengers now. Many had phones still in hand, recording everything, some visibly trembling, not from fear of Ariane, but from the awareness that they had just witnessed something historic. "No one here is safe," Ariane said, "until abuse is punished at altitude." The marshal took a step forward. He motioned quietly to the remaining crew, 2 men who hadn't moved since the scuffle began. Their faces were blank, but their eyes told stories of loyalty misplaced. "Secure the aircraft," the marshal said in a quiet, practiced voice. "We're turning around." The plane's course shifted with a subtle lurch as the captain initiated the reroute to Havex International. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere had already transformed. What had once been tension wrapped in silence now unfolded into a charged theater of reckoning. Merrick Halden sat slumped in a reserved crew seat near the galley, his dominant arm cradled in a makeshift sling fashioned by a fellow attendant. He winced with every bump of turbulence, though it wasn't the pain that haunted his eyes, it was the growing silence of judgment that saturated the air around him. He was no longer in control. A heavy irony pressed down like cabin pressure. The same zip cords Merrick had once flourished with authority now bound his ankles to the seat rail. The same ones. One passenger whispered to another, "He tied the wrong man." Another recorded him from across the aisle, phone steady, lens wide. Merrick shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. In row 4A, a man in his 70s slowly stood, his joints cracking with age as he stepped forward. He wore a weathered blazer, threadbare at the cuffs, and looked directly at Ariane Velis, whose seat had not been adjusted back since the restraint. "You stood for all of us," the man said, his voice steady despite his years. "Least I can do is give you legroom." Without waiting for permission, he motioned for Ariane to take his spot. Ariane met his eyes. "No prive." No performance, just a quiet nod of respect. He stood and shifted forward. The gesture was symbolic. It wasn't about space, it was about position, about restoring something that had been quietly stolen. But Ariane's thoughts didn't linger on comfort. His mind was already racing ahead, methodical and controlled. He turned toward the air marshal, who had now taken a supervisory position near the service galley. The man, tall, fit, maybe mid-40s, with a buzz cut and the permanent squint of someone trained to spot threats before they formed, met his gaze. "How many infractions have you logged in the past year involving crew abuse?" Ariane asked quietly, but the question landed like thunder between them. The marshal didn't respond right away. He shifted his weight and looked toward Merrick, then toward the watching passengers. "Too many," he finally said. "And most buried." Arion gave a slow, knowing nod. He reached down and activated his biometric watch with a 3-finger sequence. The screen glowed briefly, then synced with his secured briefcase, which had been returned to him during the handoff. He flipped open the lid, revealing not papers, but a black, rectangular interface unit. His encrypted device, connected through a wireless internal compliance relay. As murmurs rippled through the rows behind him, Arion connected the device to the onboard diagnostics terminal discreetly hidden beneath the jumpseat console. "What are you doing?" the marshal asked, more out of curiosity than concern. "Verifying what I already suspect," Arion replied. His voice was calm. His fingers didn't tremble. Within seconds, the internal employee database sprang to life on his device. Merrick Halden's profile blinked at the top of the screen. Arion tapped it once, then again, then froze. Dozens of entries spilled out: crew complaints, performance demerits, flight incident logs. But most of them were flagged Class B, suppressed review, suppressed, ignored, bypassed. The marshal leaned in, eyes widening. "You have this kind of access?" "I authored the compliance encryption layer," Arion replied coldly. "Every sealed complaint, every rerouted record, every buried flag. I can open them all." One by one, he unsealed the records. They weren't minor slights. They were accounts of intimidation, escalation, retaliatory behavior, most notably involving Black and Latino male passengers who had dared to question procedure or request reassignment. "You're telling me the airline knew?" the marshal asked, stunned. "They didn't just know," Arion said. "They protected him." Passengers nearby had begun listening in. Several turned toward the back of the plane, where Merrick now sat motionless, sweat streaking his forehead. His jaw clenched as if trying to hold back the reality crashing over him. The device in Arion's lap pinged again. Another sealed report. This one from just 2 weeks prior. An incident involving a restrained South Asian engineer traveling to testify in a federal patent case. The restraint had delayed his arrival by 12 hours. The charges? Non-compliant storage of carry-on. No violation had occurred. The marshal exhaled, long and slow. "This is bigger than one incident." Arion nodded. "It always was." His gaze swept the cabin. Phones were still recording. Passengers were still submitting files via airdrop to his device, now authorized as a federal intake portal through his compliance override. Dozens of live witness accounts, time-stamped, geolocked, facial verified. "This isn't just a forced landing," Arion said to the marshal, voice low and steady. "It's a structural descent." "And what happens when we hit the tarmac?" the marshal asked. Arion closed the briefcase, locking it with a hiss. He stood, straightened his collar, and looked forward toward the cockpit. His posture composed but his eyes alight with a deeper storm. "We're not just landing this plane," he said, turning toward the marshal, voice rising just enough for the passengers around him to hear. "We're grounding an entire culture." He paused. "Starting now." The wheels touched down at Havex International with a whisper of rubber on concrete. No turbulence, no announcements, no fanfare. The descent had been coordinated under silence. A route cleared not for show but precision. As the plane taxied toward Hangar 4, the passengers sat in collective stillness, not out of fear, but anticipation. They had witnessed something irreversible. And now, the man who had shifted their reality was rising from seat 2A. Dr. Arion Velis stood, hands steady, gaze unwavering, briefcase now back in his possession. His expression revealed little, calm, but not passive. Intent burned behind his eyes. A private response unit waited outside the aircraft's auxiliary stair ramp, not in uniform, but identifiable by the neutral gray jackets bearing the crest of the Independent Transport Oversight Board. This wasn't a criminal arrest. It was a containment of procedural failure. Merrick Halden, nursing his broken arm in a makeshift sling, was escorted down the aisle by the same air marshal who had once sipped coffee while ignoring his rising arrogance. Merrick's face had lost its defiance. Sweat dotted his temples. Pain, both physical and reputational, now clung to him like a second skin. "You can't do this," he muttered under his breath. "You already did," the marshal replied coldly. On the tarmac, the handoff was seamless. Arion stepped off the aircraft with no hesitation, already unzipping his briefcase, as they moved toward the terminal's secured side door. The captain followed behind with tentative steps, guilt weighing on each stride. Inside the private security suite, beneath the hum of biometric scanners and sealed terminals, the captain found his voice. "Dr. Velis, I just want to say I'm sorry. I didn't realize." Arion didn't even glance his way. His voice sliced clean. "It wasn't your silence that hurt. It was your compliance." The words landed like a verdict. The captain stopped, lips parted, unable to form another sentence. Inside the command room, Arion moved like a man reciting choreography. He connected his biometric watch to the encrypted upload port. With swift commands, he routed all footage, digital logs, intercom records, and crew rosters to 3 separate agencies: the Federal Ethics Compliance Bureau, the Aviation Misconduct Registry, and the Internal Transport Oversight Board. The files moved fast. Arion's clearance was top tier. Within 90 seconds, each agency returned a validation code. Confirmation. Chain of custody sealed. Merrick sat across the room now, isolated on a medical bench. His wrist was secured with a light restraint, though he lacked the strength to resist. A cold compress rested near his elbow. The irony dripped from the room's corners. The man who once paraded dominance, now stripped of authority, reduced to a case file under fluorescent lights. He glanced over as Arion handed a signed affidavit to the marshal. "Who are you?" Merrick asked quietly, voice trembling, not with anger, but dawning realization. Arion finally turned to face him. "I'm the one who built the protocols you broke." A silence heavier than any turbulence followed. Merrick looked down. The sling around his arm seemed to constrict further. Outside, the digital world erupted. Hashtags like #ArionGroundsAbuse, #Flight944Truth, and #VelaStandard began flooding social media. Dozens of passengers had already uploaded their angles of the incident. A former pilot retweeted the video, captioning it, "He didn't fight back. He enforced forward." A defense contractor executive added, "That man was shackled with zip cords and still gave us freedom from silence." Inside the debrief room, Arion stood before a large wall screen displaying the live feedback loop. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. A junior officer approached, holding out a tablet with incoming inquiries from press and political offices. "Sir, your response?" he asked. Arion didn't reach for the tablet. Instead, he stepped toward the single media recording panel in the room, activated its secure mode, and addressed the camera directly. "This wasn't retaliation," he said, calm and unblinking. "It was enforcement of truth." The data had barely finished uploading when the first red flag surfaced. A senior investigator from the Federal Ethics Compliance Bureau leaned closer to his monitor, eyes narrowing. "Sir," he said, turning toward Arion Velis in the debriefing room, "you'll want to see this." Without fanfare, he tapped a key. On screen, Merrick Halden's bodycam footage began to play, grainy but audible. The feed opened just moments before boarding, showing Merrick standing in the jet bridge with another male crew member, identified later as Crew Chief Harlan Vesk. Their voices were low, but the words cut through like a blade. "That's Velis," Vesk whispered. "Straylight him. Log a threat report." The room fell still. Arion's fingers tightened ever so slightly against the armrest. He didn't speak, but a quiet fury radiated through his presence. The term hadn't just been used casually. It had been operational code. Merrick hadn't acted alone. He had executed a predetermined command with procedural precision. The implications were staggering. "What is STRAYLIGHT?" the lead analyst asked cautiously. Arion didn't blink. "That's what we're about to find out." He stood up, calm but intense, and turned to the investigator. Patch me into a secure call. I want Bram Korik on the line. Now. A secure audio relay blinked green, and seconds later, Bram's voice came through with a sharp, clear tone. I figured you'd be calling the moment you saw that footage. I need the original charter for STROLIGHT, Ariane said, stepping away from the cluster of agents, voice low and measured. And the funding trail. All of it. Personnel, contracts, training modules, anything that connects this program to central aviation policy. It's already on your desk at the terminal, Bram replied, encrypted and backed up threefold. But I'll warn you, it doesn't start with Merrick. It's deeper. Bureau-level approval. Cross-agency sign-offs. Ariane didn't flinch. Good. That means we're not just cutting down a weed. We're pulling the root system. He hung up and turned back to the team. We're not investigating a rogue employee. We're dissecting an institutional algorithm disguised as enforcement. On another monitor, pattern analysis had begun. Within minutes, a cluster of archived cases emerged, incident reports flagged as passenger disruption, where Straylight had been silently referenced in internal crew logs. Each case bore chilling similarity. Restrained passengers, minimal provocation, misaligned threat narratives, and disproportionately, men of color in executive or technical roles. A younger agent, clearly rattled, looked up. This isn't policy. This is profiling engineered as protocol. Ariane approached the screen, scanning the data. 49 incidents across 13 months. Of those, 43 involved non-white men. 31 held high-clearance roles, engineers, security specialists, or classified consultants. Many had never even filed complaints, either due to fear, resignation, or career damage control. Look at the language, Ariane said, pointing to a phrase in one of the crew reports. Subject displayed elevated silence and deliberate posture, potential indicator of covert defiance. His tone was razor-sharp. They weaponized silence. Body language. They trained crew to treat composure as a threat. Dramatic irony festered beneath the surface. Merrick and others like him had been rewarded not for protecting flights, but for provoking confrontation and masking it as control. And no one had stopped them, because the program was embedded too cleanly into compliance software, shielded by euphemisms and hidden from review. The lead investigator's voice broke the moment. Dr. Velis, would you be willing to present this at the Aviation Ethics Tribunal? Ariane turned toward him, eyes steeled with resolve. This isn't just about ethics. This is about architecture. You don't just patch a broken wall. You rewire the foundation. As agents compiled a dossier and began assembling a legal record for Straylight's exposure, Ariane quietly pulled out his secure device. In the palm of his hand blinked a biometric scan, unlocking a secondary cache of data he'd logged over the years, patterns, flags, ghost protocols. He hadn't realized until now how they fit together. Merrick had been the match, but STRAYLIGHT, that was the fuse. He sent one final encrypted message to Bram. Pull training rosters, performance incentives, internal memos, everything tied to Straylight handlers over the last 2 fiscal years. Cross-match with restraint reports by race, role, and cabin class. Already in progress, Bram replied. Ariane exhaled through his nose. His mind wasn't on revenge. It was on redesign. The kind that didn't just fix a system, it replaced it entirely. As he closed the secure feed and prepared for the tribunal presentation, a thought settled like cold steel in his chest. They thought this was about discomfort. It's about system design. And we're rebuilding the blueprint. He tightened the ties, confident in control, unaware that every passenger, every movement, and every angle had already been accounted for in the CEO's plan. If you believe abuse under a uniform always collapses when faced with decisive action, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. 3 hours after the wheels of Flight 944 touched down, Ariane Velis stepped into the private boardroom of the Aviation Ethics Tribunal, not with arrogance or anger, but with the calm command of a man who had calculated every possible outcome. The room itself was sterile yet imposing, walls lined with acoustic panels, a rectangular table under cold white lights, and one central projection screen awaiting activation. Around the table sat 3 federal reviewers in crisp Navy suits, a civilian liaison nervously clutching a notepad, and a silent observer from the Department of Transport Oversight, his badge tucked, his eyes scanning like a hawk. Arion didn't wait for pleasantries. He placed his biometric case gently on the table, activated his device, and cast a holographic projection into the center of the room. A map bloomed outward, continent-wide flight paths, routes, and dots of incident markers glowing crimson. The screen populated faster than anyone anticipated. One reviewer leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as numbers populated the map. 49 restraint incidents in the last 13 months, all categorized under the internal Straylight protocol. Arion spoke evenly. This isn't a story about a single crew member. This is a system-wide response architecture designed to reward suppression. He tapped the device again. Another overlay flickered into view. Demographic data. 43 of the restrained passengers were men of color. 31 held federal clearance, held patents, or were actively involved in national security sectors. A slow exhale escaped from the liaison, as if he had been holding his breath for far too long. "You didn't just restrain me," Arion said, his voice calm but cutting. "You restrained trajectory of innovation, leadership, security, and equity." One of the federal reviewers, a graying man named Delvin Rourke, cleared his throat. "Dr. Velis, forgive me, but how did a program this detailed remain hidden from oversight?" Arion turned his gaze toward him without blinking. "You buried it under protocol. We're unearthing it under truth." The room fell heavy with silence. The civilian liaison, a younger man named Theo Merrick, scribbled furiously before finally speaking up. His voice trembled slightly. "Straylight, it's not even mentioned in the standard training modules. No budget allocations. No memos. How did you find it?" "Behavior leaves a pattern," Arion replied. "When incentives meet unchecked authority, the system adapts to reward abuse." He rotated the map again. One data point blinked, then another. Each came with a file. Passengers zip-tied for vague terms like failure to follow or aggressive posture. Each accompanied by internal logs that used Straylight code tags. Phrases like socio-friction case, threat perception log initiated, non-compliant optics neutralized. These weren't accidents. They were part of a lexicon. Dramatic irony seeped in. Merrick Halden had spoken those exact terms aloud. He hadn't invented them. He had memorized them. Across the city, the news cycle erupted like a dam breaking. CEO tied mid-flight uncovers covert airline loyalty program. The headline looped across national networks. Senators issued immediate calls for emergency hearings. A vague statement from Aerovex Airways offered no apology, only that protocols were being reviewed in light of recent events. Back in the boardroom, the observer from Transport Oversight finally leaned forward. He had remained silent the entire meeting, but now his words dropped like stones. "What you've exposed here, this rewrites how restraint tools are seen in aviation security. You understand that?" Arion gave a slight nod. "I understand it redefines who gets protected and who gets punished 30,000 feet in the air." The tribunal reviewers huddled briefly before one of them, a younger man named Jaron Solt, issued the first formal motion. Pending further investigation, all internal restraint protocols are to be temporarily frozen across Aerovex flights. Straylight tagging will be flagged for immediate review. "And the tools?" Arion asked. "All zip cords, legacy tie-down kits, and emergency loops are to be sealed unless authorized by an in-flight supervisor with federal clearance," Jaron responded. As the rest of the panel began packing up, murmuring amongst themselves about the coming political storm, the observer remained behind. He approached Arion quietly, hands behind his back, expression unreadable. "They thought you'd sue and disappear," he said softly. Arion turned his head, a faint, restrained smile tugging at the edge of his mouth, but his eyes remained cold, focused. "I'm not here for silence," he replied. "I'm here for redesign." Within 48 hours of landing, Arion Velis entered the Federal Aviation Code Repository headquarters flanked by 2 members of his legal ethics team.
No fanfare.
No news cameras. Just focus. He carried with him a thin, black case, its contents encrypted and biometrically sealed. Inside was the reform draft that had consumed every second since the Havoc's landing, a document he titled with precision, the Velis Standard. He submitted it without hesitation to the Federal Conduct Review Board, bypassing all standard lobby channels. It wasn't a request. It was an architectural correction. The document was as thorough as it was disruptive. It outlined a complete overhaul of in-flight restraint protocols, calling for AI-triggered alerts whenever physical restraints were considered, independent ombudsman on long-haul flights, and a zero-interference clause for whistleblowers reporting abuse. It also required every crew-related incident to undergo third-party compliance reviews, unaffiliated with the airline's internal PR or legal teams. The clauses weren't just recommendations, they were written as legislative-ready insertions, ready to be signed into law. "I'm not looking for approval," Ariane told the review board's chair, a stern-eyed man in his 60s with a background in regulatory law. "I'm restoring design integrity to a system that's lost it." The board was stunned, not by the reform itself, but by Ariane's refusal to accept any financial compensation, restitution, or public commendation. He declined even the proposed Presidential Aviation Justice Medal. His words echoed through the chamber, "I don't want an award for fixing what should never have broken." Meanwhile, far from the boardroom, Merrick Halden's world began to unravel. Under a federal court order, his crew file was made public. The reaction was swift and brutal. What had once been buried beneath layers of confidentiality now exposed a dark trail, years of documented escalations disproportionately targeting Black and Latino passengers. Dozens of reports previously sealed under internal behavioral discretion surfaced within hours. But what shocked the public most was a medical report dated 2 years earlier. Merrick had failed a standard psychological fitness evaluation. The document was marked, "unfit for frontline duty due to impulse and aggression triggers." And yet, in red ink at the bottom, someone had overridden it. The justification? Approved for morale continuity. Recommend reactivation. The irony pierced deep. Back at Vernatech HQ, Ariane stood before his executive leadership. The usual energy of quarterly briefings was absent. What filled the air instead was silence, the kind that precedes a shift in an organization's DNA. Ariane faced his team, a dozen top minds in AI governance and compliance architecture. "Our mission has always been structural integrity," he began, pacing slowly, voice steady. "Not just in code, but in conduct, in systems, in culture." He tapped his watch, and the room's central display came alive with cascading data points, graphs, policies, and statistical breakdowns pulled from the Straylight archive. Crew aggression algorithms, internal morale risk maps, passenger profile biases. "This is not an airline problem," he continued. "This is a framework rot. One we're uniquely equipped to fix, not just in the air, but anywhere systems are permitted to forget why they exist." One of his directors, Bram Korick, the same strategist who uncovered the Straylight Charter, looked up. "So what now? Do we build compliance software for the FAA?" Ariane didn't hesitate. "No. We build the next blueprint." He gestured to the live feed coming in from social platforms. Hashtags like #VelisStandard and #AirlinesAccountable were now trending globally. Even non-aviation corporations were requesting audits. His name was being whispered in boardrooms as a benchmark for ethical reform, though he had no interest in celebrity. His interest was precision. Outside the boardroom, reporters waited for a statement. Ariane gave them only one. "We're not pausing for the storm to pass. We're flying into it and changing the air." His final order before heading to the next security summit was clear. Ground every system that forgets who it was built to serve. The hearing room doors opened with a mechanical hiss, and Dr. Ariane Velis stepped into the chamber with deliberate, silent steps.
No entourage.
No notes. Just the man who had been zip-tied in first class, now standing in front of the National Aviation Oversight Committee, alone but unshaken. Flashbulbs from press cameras ricocheted across the marbled columns behind him. Microphones whispered static. Senators leaned forward, expecting drama. What they got instead was precision. He walked directly to the center dais, adjusted the mic with calm efficiency, and met every eye in the room before speaking. "My name is Dr. Ariane Velis," he began, voice level but sharpened by intention. "I was restrained on Aerovex Flight 944 by 3 crew members who believed silence equaled submission. It does not." A low murmur spread through the gallery. One of the senior committee members, a silver-haired man with a fatigued expression, raised his hand. "Dr. Velis, we acknowledge the incident. But to be clear, are you claiming this wasn't an isolated misuse of authority?" Ariane's response was immediate.
No.
"I'm demonstrating that it wasn't." He turned to the projection screen behind him and activated his biometric device. A holographic map bloomed into the air, interactive, color-coded, time-stamped. "This is a 12-month analysis of incidents flagged under an internal code referred to as STRAYLIGHT, he said, navigating through data with surgical clarity. 49 known cases. 43 involved men of color. 31 were professionals holding federal or corporate clearances. And in none of these cases was the incident escalated to a regulatory review board. The data shifted. Screens displayed crew notes, internal memos, and hidden video clips. Ariane didn't blink. "What happened to me isn't rare," he continued, tapping another icon. "What's rare is that I had the tools, legal clearance, and presence of mind to expose it before someone else ended up in the morgue." The room stiffened. Lawmakers exchanged concerned glances. One younger committee member leaned in. "Dr. Velis, what exactly is STRAYLIGHT? We've seen it mentioned in passenger complaints, but the airline has labeled it an informal term." "Then let's formalize it," Ariane replied. His fingers moved, cueing a bodycam feed. Straylight is a covert internal directive designed to neutralize what the airline labels as socio-behavioral friction. That includes questioning authority, refusing unjustified orders, or simply not complying with crew requests that go beyond regulatory boundaries. Most frequently, it targets high-profile non-white passengers under the guise of enforcement. He played the first video. A 63-year-old aerospace consultant calmly asking for a water refill, restrained without explanation and reported as belligerent. A second video followed. A paralyzed military veteran, unable to shift from a broken seat, labeled uncooperative, and zip-tied by 2 attendants while fellow passengers begged for empathy. Gasps echoed from the public gallery. The senior senator who had first questioned him rubbed his temple, visibly shaken. "You see restraint," Ariane said, letting the silence weigh. "But I see design. I see bonus structures incentivizing what the airline calls assertive engagement. I see templates buried in crew software that allow misconduct to be logged as protocol. I see engineered silence." The chairman cleared his throat, his voice a shade unsteady. "Why haven't these cases been brought forward until now?" "Because the system wasn't built to record the truth," Ariane said. "It was built to protect the enforcers of silence. Until now." His eyes scanned the room, not to intimidate, but to invite clarity. "This wasn't about one bad crew member. This is about the embedded phrases in your software. The edits made by public relations before incident logs reach your desks. The conflicts of interest between internal review boards and airline HR." Another senator stood. "Dr. Velis, respectfully, are you suggesting criminal intent at an institutional level?" "I'm not suggesting," Ariane said. "I'm showing you the evidence that's already on your docket, waiting to be seen by someone who isn't afraid to read it out loud." A new video played. A whistleblower confession, face blurred, detailing training seminars that praised creative enforcement and offered gift cards and travel incentives for documented escalations. One clip showed a flight supervisor whispering to a crewman, "That's a high-risk VIP, Straylight protocol. Keep him flagged." Dramatic irony hung heavy. The very term used against Ariane was now weaponized in reverse, held up to the light with undeniable clarity. Murmurs turned into silence. One senator finally whispered what the room had begun to feel. "You didn't just ground a flight." He stopped, overwhelmed. You grounded a sickness. Arion met his gaze with calm finality. Sickness can't be cured unless someone's brave enough to diagnose it. The federal hearing chamber buzzed with low voices, digital hums, and the subdued clicks of reporters' keyboards. 1 month had passed since Arion Velis declared Flight 944 compromised and brought the Straylight program into the national spotlight. Now that spotlight had widened, flooding every crevice of the aviation system with scrutiny. At precisely 9:03 a.m., the Oversight Tribunal's first session began. And by 9:10, the first wave of consequences fell like thunder on a quiet lake. 34 staff members across 4 airlines, all linked to STRAYLIGHT, were suspended pending trial. Internal memos labeled Behavioral Conditioning Initiatives were released to the tribunal. 5 regional training centers were shut down entirely for conducting what regulators now called non-compliant behavioral conditioning. What had once been justified as crew preparedness workshops were exposed as simulations that encouraged false escalation, particularly toward passengers deemed psychologically assertive or nonconformist. A majority of those targeted were men of color. Arion didn't watch these consequences unfold from afar. He sat quietly in the back row of the chamber, dressed in a charcoal suit without a tie, hands clasped, gaze locked forward. When one committee member called for him to speak, he rose without hesitation, but not before removing a sealed folder from his briefcase. Inside the folder, a contract offering him the newly created title of Federal Aviation Conduct Advisor, a symbolic position that would place him at the center of aviation ethics reforms. He read it once. Then calmly, without breaking eye contact, he pushed it back across the table. Change doesn't come from titles, Arion said evenly, voice low but cutting. It comes from tools. The panel exchanged glances. One of the officials leaned in. Dr. Velis, you'd have full access, discretionary budget, advisory command. I've had all those things before, Arion replied. And they didn't stop what happened at 34,000 feet. I'm not here to sit in another tower. I'm here to build ground support. That ground support had a name. Altimeter Trust, a fully independent ethics and oversight body, designed to audit aviation behavior in real time using AI-driven pattern recognition and behavioral analytics. Altimeter systems would be funded entirely by Vernitech Systems but operated with a legally firewalled structure. No corporate ownership, no branding, no influence. Just truth, pattern tracking, and justice. Arion had already appointed its first director, Bram Korek, his most trusted strategist, the man who helped him track down the Straylight Charter. Altimeter's mission: expose systemic patterns long before they could escalate into individual abuse. Its first batch of audits would cover the last 18 months of recorded cabin crew footage and passenger complaints across all major airlines. Already, preliminary reviews revealed over 200 cases with similar behavioral tags: non-compliant executive, assertive minority male, refused to relocate without cause. Back at the Capitol, the reverberations reached social platforms faster than press releases could keep up. The same teenager, Tavin Marrick, who had live-streamed Arion's restraint, was now a digital phenomenon. Over 3 million followers across his platforms. But instead of monetizing his fame, he turned it into a platform called Passenger Record, where he interviewed victims of similar abuse. One video featured a 27-year-old engineer named Dallin Rower who recounted how he'd been zip-tied on a flight from Jastonport to Allenville for refusing to switch seats, causing him to miss his green card interview. His application had since been delayed by 8 months. His voice cracked mid-interview. They made me choose between dignity and citizenship. When Arion saw the clip, he called Bram and said just 2 words: handle it. 3 days later, Dallin's legal appeal was fully funded. Not by Vernitech, but by Arion's private trust. Quiet, untraceable, immediate. In a press inquiry the following week, a journalist asked Arion during a live stream panel, "Do you consider what happened to you on Flight 944 a personal attack? A targeted humiliation?" Arion didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered just slightly toward the horizon through the glass-paneled wall behind him. The Capitol dome, cloud-filtered, cast a quiet silhouette on his expression. Finally, he said, "No." His voice was firm now, certain. It was a system test, and I was the firewall. The ruling came down on a cold, rain-smeared morning. No press conference, no grandstanding. Just a terse communiqué from the federal tribunal delivered to every airline director across the Federation. Effective immediately, all restraint protocols are to be brought into alignment with the Velis standard. That single line sent tremors through an industry used to shielding itself behind opaque policy and internal discretion. Inside the compliance headquarters of the Aerovex Corporation, monitors flickered as system after system was overridden. Zip cords, once the go-to tool for containment, were decommissioned overnight. In their place came softlock biometric devices, tools that would scan a restrained passenger's vitals, ensure safety thresholds weren't exceeded, and transmit real-time data to third-party oversight hubs. No more silent suppression. No more vanishing records. Crew members were called in for recertification en masse. Training modules now included psychological profiling audits and a new accountability layer, anonymous passenger feedback, securely encrypted and routed outside corporate PR influence. A single line on the final exam carried a warning that felt personal to many. Tampering with compliance feedback violates the Halden restriction. That name, Halden, carried new weight. In courtroom 12C of the Vermont District Judiciary, Merrick Halden sat motionless in a confined chair, one arm still weak from the fracture, eyes sunken from weeks of pretrial isolation. As the judge delivered the sentence, 2 years under restricted surveillance, full revocation of federal clearance, and lifetime disqualification from any role involving passenger authority, the cameras didn't flash. They weren't allowed. But the weight of silence in that chamber was louder than applause. In a quiet home office lit only by soft amber glow, Dr. Arion Velis sat watching the news feed refresh in muted rhythm. His face didn't move.
No pride. No bundekasten.
Only the steady intake of consequences rendered. On the couch nearby, his 10-year-old son, Karen, scribbled on a notepad while glancing occasionally at the screen. His school project, due the next day, sat open across his knees. The title was written in thick, uneven marker strokes. Justice at 30,000 feet. Karen looked up. His voice was tentative. Did it hurt? Arion's gaze shifted, slowly, from screen to son. He didn't answer immediately. His thoughts traveled, back to the moment the cords cut into his skin, to the deafening quiet of passengers unsure whether to help or hide, to the surge of betrayal when authority failed its most basic duty. He looked at his son again, and there was both steel and softness in his reply. "More than you know," he said, his voice low, steady. "But I'd do it again tomorrow." The plane lifted with a smooth, calculated grace as Arion Velis settled into seat 2A, the same seat where his world had bent 1 year prior.
No fanfare.
No press. Just an ordinary flight on a quiet morning, except the silence now carried weight. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber, casting long shadows across the aisle. Outside, a storm of clouds curled beneath the wings like unsettled memory. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal gray blazer, then leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engines echo through his mind like a heartbeat. Footsteps approached. Arion opened his eyes. A young flight attendant, mid-20s, sharp-creased uniform, hands respectfully clasped, stood beside him. His voice was steady, but reverent. "Dr. Velis," he began, eyes holding just enough awe to register without tipping into spectacle. "On behalf of every crew member who learned because of you, thank you." He bowed slightly. "We train differently now." Arion offered a slow nod, not out of pride, but acknowledgement. The young man stepped away, his spine straightening with a sense of purpose Arion recognized instantly. The kind born of knowing your role means something now. The seat beside him remained empty for a while. Then, just before cruising altitude, a man in his 40s slid into 2B. He carried no briefcase, just a leather notebook and the exhausted look of someone who had waited too long to say something. After a few moments of silence, the man turned to Arion. "My brother," he said softly, "was zip-tied on a regional flight last year. They said he matched a behavioral profile. That flight crew doesn't fly anymore." Because of you. Arion didn't respond immediately. His gaze stayed fixed on the clouds beyond the glass, but his expression shifted, just slightly. A breath deeper, a brow lower. Moments later, another man 2 rows ahead turned, having overheard the exchange. I was zip-tied once too, he said. Asked for a bottle of water twice. They said I was being verbally disruptive. They locked my wrists for asking. He exhaled. What you did saved more people than you know. Arion finally turned. Not to speak, just to see them. One man holding his brother's truth. Another still holding his own. He nodded once more. But inside, his thoughts drifted, not to justice, not to reform, but to the quiet terror of that flight. To the boy in 3B who had locked eyes with him while the cords tightened. The boy had watched a man be bound for being calm. And yet, he'd believed. That image had never left Arion's mind. The intercom crackled. Then came the captain's voice, mature, clear, composed. Ladies and gentlemen, we're cruising at 34,000 feet, and today's flight is fully compliant under the Velis standard. There was a brief silence, like the sky itself had taken a breath. Then, scattered applause broke through the cabin, gentle at first, then stronger. It wasn't for entertainment or arrival. It was a sound of shared awareness, a collective release. Acknowledgement without spectacle. But Arion didn't move. His hands rested still on the armrests, fingers unclenched. He didn't turn to the applause. He didn't even blink. He simply stared out the window again, where the clouds stretched endlessly beneath them like a sea of unspoken memories. Then he closed his eyes and let the silence wash over him. It wasn't about breaking the cords. It was about making sure no one else ever had to. He restrained the CEO and froze as the cords broke. The attendant's arms snapped, and the entire flight was grounded under his authority. If you believe true power protects and punishes simultaneously, subscribe now because justice always lands first and hardest. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, abuse of authority, and the power of composure and strategic action in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every passenger.